In this lesson series, we'll tackle a very important question. How does life evolve? Now, the story that modern science puts before us is one in which chemistry somewhere on Earth some 4 billion years ago produced life. Perhaps underneath the oceans in these volcanic hydrothermal vents. This is one of the leading ideas about the birthplace of life. Now, these volcanic structures have an interesting feature. They have tiny little chambers, roughly the size of cells. So scientists believe that lots of interesting chemistry was happening inside these tiny chambers. In fact, the very kinds of chemistry that was going on inside living cells today. So over here we see an artist's rendering of some of these early cells emerging from their rocky nurseries. And the idea is within this membrane boundary, the chemistry going on inside the cell here was originally happening inside these rocky chambers. Part of that chemistry was producing lipid molecules, which can spontaneously assemble into membranes, and that allowed this bag of chemistry to leave its rocky nursery to brave the new world, the oceanic environments all over the planet. So we have chemistry producing cellular life. Now that seems like a fantastical story, but we have to remember how much time elapsed between the beginnings of this chemical process and the emergence of life. We're going to call this deep time. What does deep time mean? Long periods of time. Hundreds of millions of years of chemistry producing all kinds of complex molecules in these tiny cellular-sized chambers that interacted to form a more complex structure that today we call cells. So that's the story. Chemistry produced cellular life on planet Earth. But that's not the end of the story. And remember, this was 4 billion years ago. Well, since then, life has changed. And so now we have to tell the story of how do you go from a simple bacteria-like cell to a tiger or a tree or a person? How do you do that? Well, again, we have to remind ourselves about deep time. We're talking 4 billion years. And so that is a really, really long time. And the modern science, again, is suggesting that with that length of time, you can undergo a series of changes, starting from simple cellular life to form complicated multi-celled organisms like tigers and trees and people. The key, of course, is DNA. So DNA is the hereditary molecule for life on Earth, and it has 3 features. It carries information to do what? To build proteins that the cell uses to carry out the chemistry of life. In addition, DNA can be duplicated so that cells can reproduce, and remember, reproduction allows life to avoid the relentless march of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. And finally, when DNA is duplicated, sometimes mutations happen, and that means the offspring will be different from each other and their parents, and this means that living things can change over time. So the ability for DNA to change its information content is the key to evolution. It's the fuel for evolutionary change. And again, we have to imagine then that in 4 billion years' time, you can get a lot of change every generation with new mutations happening. That concept of deep time, we've encountered it before when we told the story of the universe. Again, early on in the universe, there were just hydrogen and helium atoms. But in time, gravity compressed those atoms into stars, and stars cooked new, heavier elements, and supernova blasted them out into space, and nebula formed, and now we have rocky planets. And on one of those planets, some interesting chemistry produced life. This is deep time in terms of the physical history of our universe. But then, once life emerged on planet Earth, of course, 4 billion years of time elapsed until we have all of the living things that we see today. In the next part, we'll use a concrete example to examine how living things can change over time, how they can evolve.